Okay, we are live. So I'm Jolynn from Wild Pony Eventing, and we are here today with Kerry O'Brien and Lee Williams to talk about wild horse herd management. So let's start with Kerry. Please tell us a little bit about yourself so people get to know you a little bit.
Hi, my name is Kerry O'Brien, and I have Mustangs. I was really thrust into the world of wild horses through no plan of my own. I had left LA in 2014 to travel in a casita trailer. I just knew I had to leave. I had no plan. I had no agenda. I didn't know where I was going.
Were you a horse person?
I was. I mean, when I was a kid, I was horse crazy. I had a horse in high school. I had a horse in California in my 20s. I rode for a trainer for a while, hunter jumpers. And then I had to make, some hard personal decisions. And every time I tried to get back into it, you're in a big city. It's really expensive. I mean, it's $600-800 a month minimum to board a horse. I could never make it happen, or I'd ride other people's horses, but they were really just, kind of rank and not very satisfying, but it was always there. I mean, I was watching Buck Brannaman videos and I don't even know why. No reason to do that. So within 3 weeks of leaving, I was trying to figure out my route up to Jackson Hole and found out I could camp on an HMA outside of Rock Springs. I'm like, oh,
Okay.
that sounds pretty cool. And I was a photographer. So I went up and it was just, amazing. I mean, horses were just there. That White Mountain herd is easy to photograph. And then I couldn't find horses. So I'm thinking, well, I should stop at the local BLM office and get a map. Well, there's the local BLM office on my way back, and I'm like, well, I'll come back. And it's like, no, this is, go in there now. And I went in and the gal says, well, do you want to talk to our wild horse person? And I'm like, all right. So I met Kathy Fine and she said, well, this and this is happening. And as soon as they raise the injunction, we're going to start the big 2014 checkerboard gather. Do you want to go and be on the list? And I'm like, well, I got no plans, so I stayed up there. I went on the gather. My first day, I was standing between Carol Walker and Ginger Catherine's. I met everybody. I met Christy Chapman. I met the Coutures. I mean, I met so many people there. It was amazing. And I met my horse there. I shot her before she was gathered. Wow. So from there, I mean, things just kept unfolding like that. I had to go back to LA. Oh, okay. Well, there's a RAC meeting in Ely. I met Shauna Richardson. I met Laura Lee. I met Netta DeMaio. I met Dr. Kirkpatrick, which is, a high point for me. And it just kept rolling. And then it ended up, the horses got taken to Canyon City. I was in Florida for the winter. The gal that adopted my horse lived in North Carolina. And I was like, well, that's not so far away. And I went up and she gave her my wild pictures. And we had a deal that if she ever rehomed that horse, she would call me first.
Okay.
A year later, I get a call. And then Ashley Rose, somebody says, Ashley Rose is driving to Oregon to get Kigers with an empty trailer. Okay.
I remember when she did that.
Yeah, you're getting this horse. So the Mustang community is just, it's an amazing community of people. And they just made it happen. I still had no place to live, right? I still see a trailer, but I had this horse. She came in and, I rented a place for the winter up in near Salida and found a place to stick her to get her, started because she had had a foal and the gal hadn't really done anything with her. I mean, she's not a crazy horse anyway, but that was it. And then I had to buy her a ranch and,
just... You had to buy your horse a ranch.
Yeah. I haven't looked back, I mean, she changed my life. So that's the story. And then of course, because I had met all these people from all these different sides of the management equation, I got very, very involved and very educated. And like I'm sure Lee knows, You can't separate the story of wild horses from the history.
Right.
And I don't mean, oh, they're a legend, that, but really the nuts and bolts history of the West and Kit Carson and the Spanish and
Mhm.
yeah, it's the more you dive into history, I find that fascinating.
Yeah. Okay. Lee, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh, my entrance into the Mustang world started in 2000 after taking a camping trip with our horses in the Kiger HMA and spotted a few horses. They were going to have a gather the following year, so I got my first one then, and it just became an infatuation from that point.
Was that
It
Ronnie?
was a great place. Yeah, Ronnie. Yep. It was a great place to go off season from elk hunting to go out and hunt horses out in the wild with a camera. You know, it was the same, basically the same function as hunting. And so it filled a void. And then it just started getting really interesting to do. Finding the herds was very difficult, but once finding them and getting good at finding them, it became a lot more productive going out. I learned a lot about them in the wild. I learned a lot about the range and just how things work out there. And over the years, everything's kind of changed, but stayed the same, I guess. But it's just been a long evolution to get to the point where I'm at right now. At one point in time, I was always wondering, what my observations were and how accurate they were and this and that. But now I'm at the point where I've reassured myself of what I'm seeing is what I'm actually seeing, and I'm picking up new stuff every day. A couple of years ago, I started putting game cameras out, and that was a game changer as far as
Yeah.
understanding what's going on out there. Looking back now at the different events that I witnessed and would learn something, it was all times when I was tucked up behind a tree and just watching them and they didn't know I was there. The horses get very relaxed when you're standing there watching them. You would think that life is normal for them at that point, but boy, when you're around and they know you're around, no matter how relaxed they look, they are not living their life like they normally do at all.
Right.
But when you get the game camera, then you start seeing these little moments, and I started realizing, yeah, so I'm kind of leaning towards not just getting out there and getting pictures of them, but hiding and getting pictures of them and just watching them that way. So it's changed quite a bit over the few years, but I still have probably one of the largest fossil fuel footprints on the face of the earth with all the diesel.
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of miles.
Okay. You're not on horseback at all anymore when you go out?
No, Mara's lame right now, and I do have some horses that most of the time it's people throwing me on their Kigers out in the HMA.
I saw a post
Just
that
in
you were
case.
on Tico.
Yeah, Tico, he was I went out there with his owner and her other Kiger. And then with Salsa and Shelby, we went out there and I rode Salsa
Right.
out there too, although she had already been out there before. But Shelby was his first time back out there. And so, yeah, the problem is I'm so busy right now, and I've gotten myself so busy right now. I've got two premium horses that if I just got them fully gentled and under saddle, I'd have probably one of the best saddle horses out there. So it's a matter, I got to get Ernesto in the game here real soon. And yeah, it's just no way avoiding it now. It's just going to sheer time.
Okay. So before we go to the next topic, full disclosure, how many Kigers do you have now?
Oh God, I have at least as many as I have.
Howard.
I think I finally did the math the other day. I think it's 5 rescue / special needs ones, 3 adopted, and one loaner in training.
Okay.
And yeah, so whatever that works
8
out
plus
to be.
1. 8 plus 1.
Plus
Kerry,
one, yeah.
Kerry, you just have the one?
No, I have Sparkle and I have a Sulphur mare and a Burro.
Ah, okay. Okay. Is the sulfur from the wild?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Cool. Okay.
With the sulfurs and the Kigers, you always have to check.
Yes. It's different. I think that the only 2 herds that I'm aware of that people breed outside of the herds. So, okay. tell us all a little bit about what the current stats are for how many horses are in the wild and how many are sitting and holding. Who can tell me that?
Probably Kerry's best with the figures.
Okay,
Well, I mean, I don't have the for
Go ahead.
this year because, they gathered a lot of horses this year.
right.
They were shooting for 20,000. So last year, say if there were 80,000 on the range, I think they're talking about 60-ish, but then that puts more in holding. So holding is surging.
Right.
From-
So holding was at 50. Does that mean they're up to 70 now?
Yeah, I don't know. So that 20,000, those will adjust based on what the actual gather figures were for this year. And although a lot of, and I know you don't want to be too political, but a lot of people don't know that that was part of something in 2018 called the Path Forward, where some people from all sides of the table proposed that HSUS, Return to Freedom, Protect the Harvest was in on it. But people had to come together at some point. You just can't keep this.
Right.
And it was an acknowledgement that, the horses need to get down to, if not AML, something closer to AML, because we don't have, other than outright sterilization, we don't have a way to reduce populations to a sustainable level. And it gets quite complicated, but that's why, their objective for gathering so many horses was part of that plan.
Right.
There's a lot to be said about that, but that's all I'll say right now.
Okay.
And I think the plan, if they executed it as they planned on executing it, might leave long-term holding with a slight bit more or an equal amount of what's in the wild. But then again, the wild numbers are so high, 1 year's full crop can just throw all those plans all to hell, basically.
Right. Okay. So I think it's safe to say that most every herd management area is at or above capacity.
Yes.
Pretty much.
Yeah, even
Okay.
the recent ones gathered were not gathered down to their low AML.
Right.
They're either still way above the high AML or only gathered down to high AML.
Okay. And AML is the carrying capacity of that area. Okay.
Yes.
So given that the numbers are basically at the top for almost all the herds, but we've also had environmental disasters over the past few years with drought. What herds are currently in crisis? So I know there have been a lot of gathering specifically of herds that are in crisis, but can you talk about that a little bit?
I could refer to a few what's going on in Oregon. Probably they're good examples because they're not the sized herds that you would see down in Nevada. Some of them nowhere near the comparison, but because of Oregon's dealing with a drought situation, you all of a sudden have resources stretched to extreme levels. And there has been quite a few instances in the past couple of years, especially with some of the emergency gathers that they've done, that really they were all done probably too late in hindsight, but they were done on an emergency gather basis. Which is really the only way the BLM in Oregon was allowed to do gathers the past couple of years. The number of gathers were allocated to Wyoming and Nevada proportionally, and Oregon was told you're going to have to sit it out for a few years.
Why?
So it's been kind of a good barometer to see what happens. A herd of 200-300, how do they get through a drought situation? And generally speaking, they're affected right away. Water issues, Sheep's Head area had an emergency gather. It's a big complex there, so it was quite a few HMAs in one. But basically, there was a rancher there that had been watering a part of that herd for years, and basically just told the BLM, "I'm done. You better come get them because I'm done." And there was quite a few bad situations found out there. Another one was Paisley, which is a history of going through 8-year cycles of no management and then massive overpopulation. And
Where
I
is
spoke
Paisley?
to some Paisley, southeastern Oregon, kind of towards Lakeview area,
Okay,
or kind of west of Bend or southeast of Bend. And I talked to somebody specifically that went out there when she got heads up of what was going on, and found dead mares with foals lying next to them. And the BLM did an emergency gather there too. And every 8 years they gather them down to 100, and then they don't do anything for 8 years, and then all of a sudden there's 800 horses there again. And so
yeah,
the numbers don't lie. The sad part is that it was only emergency gather was the only reason they're allowed to go in there, and usually by definition something's very wrong at that point.
yeah,
And water resources can dry up really quick, especially the flowing ones. A water hole, you can witness it slowly dry up, but when they're relying on spring-fed, very small creeks, they can dry up remarkably fast. I watched one lose 400 yards of flow in less than 12 hours and
Yeah.
totally change the dynamics of that area for water resources. And they can just shut off like that. And so it's a big problem, even if you don't have 1,800 in the herd. Because remember, there's nobody out there keeping track of this stuff. Like the BLM, absolutely nobody out there to go check on horse herds,
Wow.
unless they get a call about something. But it's just not in but myself, they were told me to deal with the rancher, as far as gates and stuff like that. So I keep a relationship with the rancher and keep him in the loop of what I'm doing. He keeps me in the loop of what he's doing. And if it wasn't for him and myself, there would be a lot of catastrophes out there, right? Even
Yeah.
in a well-managed HMA.
Okay. Carrie, what
So-
about other herds?
Well, I wanted to address a question that you started to raise is
Okay.
like, why weren't they gathered?
Right.
TML,
Thank you.
emergency gathers, and it's that there's no room in holding. There's no room at the end.
Okay.
There's no place to put them. So until, like, was it last year or the year before? I mean, actually, it's been several years. BLM has put out bids for contractors who want to house horses in their pastures. Some cattle ranchers are just keeping horses. So they put
Wow.
out bids for those contracts, but they can only gather horses if they have room to stick. Where are they going to put them? Right.
Yeah.
So that's what determines the gather schedule and why some HMAs are not gathered, for 8 years. And then in terms of the, disasters, there's also been fire. Fire's been a big one in recent years.
Okay.
And it's an ugly one, when they lose hundreds of thousands of acres, hundreds of square miles
Yeah.
of grassland. And I mean, I know a couple of BLM guys that have gone up on those, and it's not pleasant to get.
Are the fires moving the herds, or how does that happen?
Well, this brings us to another major problem. And if you understand history, you see why.
Mhm.
The HMAs, as we know them today, are, as Lee knows, they're really big pastures.
Yeah.
Now might be 1 million acres in sense of some of these big complexes, but there are fences, gates are open, gates are closed. There's migration between HMAs, but
Right.
one of the quotes that it was surprising to me, but for perspective, Tom Marvel of the Marvel Ranches in Nevada, his family, from the 1800s was a sheep herding family,
Mhm.
and they would follow from southern Nevada up to Winnemucca and Battle Mountain in that area. And he said, the horses at that time would migrate 100 miles a year from southern Nevada to
Yeah.
northern Nevada and back with the weather. There were no fences.
Yeah.
And so, and this is a problem, with mule deer and antelope. You start to fragment the habitat and affect the migration routes, and then that has an impact on the resource.
Sure.
And this is where it gets very, very complicated. So at this point, we sort of have, these legacy horses in huge pastures. What's your feeling about that, Lee?
Well, the two key points that I like to use as a litmus test to anything to do with the wild horse management, especially to see where a point is brought up, how it fits politically. The two issues are long-term holding and how it's going to be managed in the future, because it is only financed every year. Every year Congress goes, yeah, okay, we'll allocate this amount of money to it. It's to call it long-term is kind of misleading. Some of their contracts might be long-term, but the
It's really
financing
year
for
by
those
year.
horses, yeah, year by year, and
Yeah.
we're doing it the most expensive way possible by doing it year by year, instead of looking at the fact that we have so many horses, they only live 25 years. So what we need is to finance these horses over 25 years. Now, if you go to buy a house and you get a mortgage because you can't afford to buy the house all the up front, but spread out over 30 years, and that mortgage payment amortized over that 30 years, it became possible to purchase the house. So if we looked at the long-term holding as, you know, if we truly are going to be taking care of these horses for the next 25 years, and we truly should have a financial plan to take care of them, we should know what those costs are. And chances are, if we looked at it from that point of view, we could amortize those costs, spread them out over, because as a 25-year contract expires, there's going to be a lot of those horses that have naturally passed
Right.
on, and we're going to be putting a lot less in on the back end than we are in the front end. So to try to find a way to balance that, and to be honest, it's a government issue, it's a government's problem, and boy, they're really good at balancing and spreading out financing over 25, 30 years when they see fit. So I think if that was decided on, then you would have a place to put the excess horses, and in a good environment for the excess horses. And the reason that's important is my other key point is in the wild, it reaches a point where you get exponential population growth. Like right now, if you had a herd of 50, you're getting a few foals a year. If you get a herd, that herd grows to be 150. Well, you're still only getting a few foals a year, and you could probably manage it with bait trapping. Well, all of a sudden, then if you ignore it, it's 350, 400 horses in that HMA, then bait trapping is not going to work, and you can only do a helicopter gather. When those numbers get up to 15, 1600, then all of a sudden a helicopter gather isn't going to do you much good, because as Kerry stated, where are you going to put the horses?
Yeah.
So any plan should always be compared against, how is it going to affect long-term holding? Does it make sense with long-term holding? And how is it going to affect the range management? Pulling the horses off, treating the horses, whatever. But how are you going to manage what's left on the range? And if you do the basic math, and if the BLM got, and this is path forward, bottom line plan was, if they remove the horses down to their roughly 30,000 that they figure are supposed to be in the wild, and then they could maintain that, but you'd still have at the time, math wise, up to 90,000, let's say at that time, in long-term holding. So they're kind of two different issues. They're linked, but the solutions for each are completely different. They're two completely different issues, and they should never be mixed together. Managing the numbers in the wild is a totally different issue than financing the long-term horses.
Right.
And the totally different specialists needed to figure that out too.
Okay, so let me regurgitate the current strategy and tell me what part of this I'm correct and incorrect on. So we've got these wild herd management areas all over the West. When those numbers get too big, the BLM gathers and brings horses into short-term holding, where they try to either adopt them out or sell them via sale authority. Those horses that don't leave go to long-term holding, and currently the herd management areas, short-term holding and long-term holding, are full.
Yes.
Pretty much, yeah. And
Okay.
I want to clarify, since this is sort of an educational forum,
Right.
the name long-term holding a few years ago was changed to off-range pasture.
Okay.
Yeah, because they may be confused. And I think one of the reasons they may have done that is because, off-range or, long-term holding, there is a contingent of people that believes that the horses are standing around in feedlots, when the long-term holding / off-range pasture I mean, those horses have better pasture than mine have here.
Yes, I've seen those pastures. They're lush.
Right. So, I mean, and they're in the grassland states where
Yeah.
horses can be.
Yeah.
So it's not a feedlot situation.
Right.
Short-term holding is a little more that kind of thing because those horses are constantly being moved around and shipped and
Right.
yeah.
So the pictures that people see online of the corrals are short-term holding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or the prison.
There is some of them newer ones, contracts that have gone out to handle technically an overflow of short-term holding. And so they're optimistically not long-term holding, but those I would assume as soon as they'd get the larger pastures available, those horses would move there. But yeah, there's a lot of short-term holding now than there was before. Yeah,
Right.
substantial amount more.
Okay, so we have a crisis because every place that we have for our wild horses is full right now, whether it's short-term holding, long-term holding, or the wild herds. So what do we do?
We have a hoarding.
Well, one thing that the people are going to have to decide, and the sooner it's decided, the better, is the public's got to decide, first of all, what to do with long-term holding horses, because if you have a good long-term holding plan, then that means you also have a good plan for the excess that are still to be removed from the wild. So, do the people want a long-term holding for the duration of the life of the horse? If you asked everybody, I think the vote would still be 85% of the country would say yes. But the people that are making some of these decisions might not be listening that deeply on that. So long-term holding can't be ignored anymore. It's going to have to expand, and it's going to have to be better financed. And then you can at least start doing more removals from the wild. You're going to find everybody all over the board about what to do with long-term holding. There's a lot of advocates now that are calling for them to be rewilded and put back out in the wild. And
Where?
Well, it doesn't matter where. That they don't have to explain that, because my litmus test for those two issues I mentioned, their policy can't explain how it'll work. And so it's not a matter of them actually explaining how their ideas will work. It's just a matter of they're saying what people want to hear. People want to hear that the Mustangs can go back to the wild. And if that's the point, if that can be done, please explain how it's going to work. Because if you put 100,000 mares back in, or 50,000 mares back into the wild, what's going to happen then? Or if those hundreds of thousands of horses that have been removed in the past 10, 15 years weren't removed, we would have 500,000+ horses in the wild. So, more explaining needs to be done. So you always got to be careful. Any idea somebody comes up with, how does it actually function? It might be a feel-good idea, but will it really work?
Kerry
and
has
that's
some
why
ideas.
you'll find ideas like a PCP. It's a very useful tool. Fertility control can be a very useful tool, but when it's marketed as a save-all, those of us that have been out in the wild and realize that in 1 million acres, getting close enough to shoot a couple mares is pretty darn tough. And it's one thing when it's one of the herds that are very easily accessible, but boy, it's not nothing you're going to catch up on and get ahead of the game.
You're referring to a birth control chemical that has to be shot into the horse with a gun
while it's still in the wild, to maintain it. And at this point, all you're doing is trying to stop exponential population growth. You're not going to fix any problem, but that's one way to keep them in the wild, But just realistically, it all gets back to, what are you going to do with the excess that is still in the wild? And even if you, one of the other solutions is remove the cows. Well, that doesn't do anything either. That sure is a simple fix if you're looking for the easy fixes, but that doesn't stop them from breeding, and if we can't have 80,000 in now and manage them, why would we make more room for those 80,000? And then 4 years down the road, there's 140,000, 150,000. Then what are you going to do? You're going to find yourself in a situation like in Australia where the general public there is like, hundreds of thousands of horses. Well, we're not going to pay to take care of them, and they'll go out and cull them, and
Yeah.
so numbers matter. Numbers do matter. And boy, I don't care if it's a HMA with 600,000 acres, of that 600,000 acres, there might only be about 110,000 that any horse would find any food on, and that 110,000 is allocated for the horses, the wildlife, and the cattle in that area. It doesn't matter if there's 600,000. There's only 100,000 acres that actually produce food that they can eat.
Right.
And so you can't just numbers matter. There's no way around it. Numbers matter, and horses breed. And unless you're addressing those, you're just it's just horrible.
Okay. Carrie, talk to us a little bit about some management ideas, because we're in a mess.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things that popped up, while Lee was talking is, like you mentioned carrying capacity. A lot of people don't realize if they live where it rains 50 inches a year, we're looking at 5 to 10 inches of rain a year. The stocking rate is 50 to 100 acres per animal. The stocking rate here where I live in Montezuma County for a horse is 40 to 50 acres to support a horse for a year. And
Wow.
it's, and then when you look at the historical piece, it's funny because the number keeps expanding. Well, there used to be, 500,000 wild horses. Well, there used to be 1 million, and now it's 2 million. But if you look at where those horses were, doesn't matter if if it was 100 million, they were in Texas, they were in Oklahoma, they were in the grassland states, they were in California. The reason that BLM owns so much, or the federal government owns so much public land in the Great Basin, is because there was nothing there.
People don't want to live there.
It's it's not the greatest place, it's very barren. There's I was reading a Lewis and Clark expedition history where these guys it's called rabbit fever. They didn't see big game for so long, and they were eating rabbits that it's such a lean meat that your body starts to eat itself up because it's not getting any fat, so you start eating your own liver.
Wow.
It's not, it's not a great environment for large ungulates. So, they do run cattle. The cattle are very managed. It's, I'm not going to get into the cattle versus horses argument, because again, it's an incredible oversimplification. And the cattle ranchers are who are providing a lot of water for the horses that are there at their own expense. So,
Right.
I think, again, we have to look a little bit at history. Right now, I mean, it kind of rankles me that, they had this path forward thing, and yeah, they went gung-ho on the gather side of it. But again, the contraceptive side, that the gathering is great, but it's a thumb in the dike unless you limit reproduction. Right now, there's, like when we hear, oh, horses are going extinct, it's insane. They're reproducing like rabbits. Right now, we could sterilize, with PZP, Gonacon, other, contraceptive vaccines, there's certain non-responders, which gets into a whole genetic, rabbit hole.
Right.
But we can vaccinate every mare out there, and mares could be sterilized and not give birth for 5 years or 10 years, and horses will not be going extinct. We need to stop the breeding.
Okay. Are there viable ways to vaccinate them, and something effective and doable?
Again, it's it's an educating the public thing. The thing I think that and they've done some behavioral studies on PZP and Gonacon and stuff, and there are some behavioral disruptions, but they're not consistent through every HMA. There's an
Really?
article Oh, PZP, you know, it makes the mares cycle late and they start having foals in winter. Well, there's a study about that. The bell curve shifted 2 months, and within 2 years after not being treated, it shifted back. The fact is, horses do breed, there's a bell curve, but they do breed all year round. There's foals, and cows born in winter all the time.
Yeah.
It's just that most of them are born in May and June. And then
Right.
there's, you know, the stallions, the mares won't settle and the stallions are fighting. You see that in some places. You don't see that in others. In my opinion, and of course, people will lose their minds, spaying older mares, because the mares don't live as long as stallions. It's very, very expensive for them to be nurturing a foal, have you know, an embryo, have a foal on them, this year's foal. Last year's foal is still nursing.
Yeah.
Sometimes even a 2-year-old will come in and nurse for comfort. That's such a tax on that mare, so
Right.
that they often don't live past 20 or so, where the
Right.
stallions will live into their
Right.
late 20s.
And for people who aren't from the West, these are mares who are trying to exist on what those of us in the East Coast would consider scrub grass.
Right, right. You know, and then when you get into drought and everything else. So it's really hard on the mares. If I was a mare and I was 8, 10, 12 years old and had already contributed, 3, 4, 5 surviving foals to the genetic pool, spaying doesn't sound like too bad of an alternative. Get those stallions off me.
How do you spay a wild horse?
Well, that's the thing. There's multiple methods. They were studied, and the safest method for both the horse and the veterinarian was considered colpotomy, where they go in through the uterus. The horse is in a standing sedation, and the fallopian tubes are pinched off.
Okay.
And it's a surgery that's commonly done on other animals. It is done occasionally on horses.
Mhm.
And the way it was sold by certain people was, it's horrible. They rip their ovaries out, and there's no, and it's field surgery, which that's how you geld horses. You lay them down in the corral most of the time. Most horses are not gelded in a surgical suite.
Right.
So for people who don't understand, ranching veterinary care, they were just completely freaking out. My vet neuters ranch dogs on the tailgate of his truck.
Yeah.
That's field surgery.
So have they been spaying mares, or has that not been allowed?
There was such an outcry that people were just screaming, and you can tell because they use the same key words over and over, they're horrific, barbaric, and all of this stuff. And then CSU and another university got enough backlash from probably their endowment people that they pulled out of the study. And the surgery was not the study. The surgery's been well studied. The study was to have a control group and a spayed group in, 100-acre pastures and study the behavioral effects.
Gotcha.
So,
it was Warren Springs was supposed to be the study group, and it was going to be, they left 100 horses out untouched, basically, and they had 100 that they were going to put back as spayed. So they had a controlled group of 100, and the 100 herd was going to have a certain percentage of those mares spayed, and it never did. That's the way it was going to happen. And then it just dropped off, though. Like Kerry was saying, a lot of people were against it, but in all fairness, the study was the only study was going to be done was going to be the behavioral aspects. They'd already determined the methods that they wanted to use. And I think from what I understand, a lot of the universities and stuff also kind of might have shied away from it because they wanted a spay system that they could do in the field. any horse brought into the BLM corrals could be spayed safely and stuff, but they wanted something that they could do in the field. And I think that's probably where the whole thing kind of fell apart at that point.
And I think it was going to be done at Burns in the corrals. And
yes, yes, but that wasn't, it was long term. The program was to be designed for field spaying. Yeah.
Would have to be gathered. They have to be in a chute to protect the veterinarian that's doing it. They're in a chute and they're in a standing sedation. There's some, like I know from the gelding that we did on the horse at Mesa Verde, a wildlife sedative called BAM, and it I mean, they can put an amnesiac in it too. So I mean, those horses are pain, the pain is mediated, they're like in a hypnotic state. I was gonna be
well, even in the field, they were going to have holding pens and chutes and everything, but it was just they needed a program they could do in the field. They would have handled it the same way they did when they pulled them into Burns.
Why aren't horses, when they're gathered and brought into short-term holding, why aren't they then treated?
Well, you got to understand that because different states handle things differently. In Nevada, they do what's more of a gate cut. They'll go out, gather a certain amount of horses from an HMA, and then that's it. Once they got them, in they go. Oregon will try to mostly do a complete gather of an HMA and then do a selective return and then return them back. So yeah, they could always do that, and they have treated mares in the past with PCP before they put them back. But to try to find one that would work with both, it's completely different scenarios. Fertility treatments like that, its usefulness, how it's applied, where it's going to benefit, where it's not going to benefit, is so specific. It can't be a cure-all just because of the sheer numbers, so to speak. I'm not a big fan of fertility control treatments because in theory, they're not needed if we were at AML. If we were at AML of 30,000 in the wild, it would require 3,000 to 4,000 removed each year to stay there, and the adoption program could easily handle that. So that's the thing, we don't need it if we're at AML. If we're trying to not get any higher, we need it. If we're not going to reduce our numbers greatly by doing it, and if we're removing the horses anyway, because AML is the important thing, then we're still putting a mouth to feed back in if it's a sterilized horse. So it gets to the point where, and I've always been in favor, and I've talked to the people that were trying to get the spaying program going and saying, why don't you start easy? Why don't you just select older mares, that, 10% of the oldest mares, they're, put them back out, sterilize them, and let them live their life out there. It cuts long-term holding costs. They're not going to be producing anyway. It has no effect on natural selection or genetic diversity because they could have a 15, 20-year breeding history by that point. But if it depends on your confidence in the BLM, or if they're going to have a HMA with 100 horses in it, and they're going to bring them all in the 8 AMLs, 100 horses. When they put those 50 mares back, how many were they planning on sterilizing? And if you tried to get a straight answer from the BLM regarding the Warm Springs, you couldn't. But signs where they would have sterilized 35 of those 50 mares going back. So then you have 15 mares producing. You still have you're at high AML, and you got the same amount of horses eating from the resources out there. So even it's still not a fix-all. And then how is that 15% going to be managed that are out there? If you're doing a selective return, that 15% could be the best of the best, not as big a deal. If you're doing a gate cut, and then you're limiting it. So you're also controlling the breeding at that point. And there's some HMA that are around 100, 200 horses that they've been maintaining a stable population with PCP treatments. And they have a policy of, as Kerry is mentioning, after a certain amount of years producing and contributing to the gene pool, then those mares would be start being treated, or they could be treated at a younger age, then allowed to produce and be treated again. Well, there's no way around the fact that you are sticking your nose in natural selection when you're doing that. And if these horses lose their natural selection status, what's the point? You know, what's their protection then? No, it's just a breeding program. It's just a breeding program. So, you know, the end goal would be get to AML or get across the board, and then we don't have to worry as much about it. We could sterilize a few of the oldest mares and leave them out there, and that would leave room maybe for some of these AMLs to be a little higher than they are. For people don't realize some AMLs are as low as 45. The Keigers, their AML, low AML is 55 horses. Riddle is 45 horses. And, you know, if it wasn't for the fact that Burns in Oregon puts a lot of effort into managing, they manage them as one herd. They do genetic diversity tests on horses that they brought in. They'll add 2 or 3 mares from other HMAs every 4-year gather cycle to increase, to add genetics to simulate if there was no fencing is a better way to look at it.
Right.
And you know, and they manage it, but you know, myself, from what I've seen right now lately, that's a lot of management stuff that they don't have time for nowadays. So my concern is, what are you damage are you going to do to these herds that are 45 and 55, trying to make them like they're part of the problem with the herds that are 1,500 to 2,000. So why implement a plan for 2,000 horses on a herd of 45? You have to look at the consequences of it. But I have no problem with going out and certain of, I won't say any brand names, but certain fertility treatments are just lovely now to the BLM because they have a sign that their long-term sterilization is rather long-term. So, you know, that particular treatment, I see no problem using that for an older mare, whereas on a younger mare, I don't like the idea of treating a small herd with PZP, but if it's a blanket treatment, if the herd is way over AML and you just got to get in there and stop the exponential population growth, if you can get in there and treat as many mares as possible, you might be influencing natural selection, but that's not the point of that. It's a desperate measure. You have to do something. Something has to be done.
So how do we?
Does something have to be done with a herd of 45? In that respects, no, I don't think it does. And I think you just got to keep that in perspective. To each reaction, there's an equal and opposite reaction, basically, in those terms.
Okay. How do we get these to, I have 2 questions. How do we get them to AML other than birth control? And why are we only talking about mares?
I was going to bring actually, because some of your listeners, watchers may ask, you know, why don't they just geld the stallions? The obvious thing is one stallion can cover hundreds and hundreds of mares. If there's one stallion left intact, now you have a huge genetic bottleneck, and those mares will have colts that will be sexually mature, and that is just a mess. So gelding the stallions really isn't ideal. And as far as the management, like Spring Creek Basin, AML is, I think they just raised it from, I don't know, like 64 to 68 horses or something, because the range is doing okay. And it's all handled with PZP by TJ Holmes. And again, they every so many years, like they just brought in, I think, some Sandwash Basin mares in the last year or so, 3 mares. And so they are introducing and trying to stay true to phenotype. That's a very small HMA, and the horses are not that difficult to dart. When you're talking 1 million acres and the best time to dart is in winter before the mares start to come into estrus in the spring. Right. Well, those places are just inaccessible. I'm in complete agreement with Lee, is at this point, we just need to stop the bleeding, right? The breeding and the bleeding. And as far as the management goes, if they do not gate cuts, but return selective horses like they do with the Keigers, and sometimes they do with the sulfurs, and select for phenotype so that that HMA is known for, you know, like known for pintos or known for the sulfurs, very Spanishy, or the Keigers. Yes, that's management. Do we want to get into a philosophical argument about having better horses that can be adopted when they are gathered versus, you know, like a fertility control is just a more blanket unless they start, you know, choosing. But at this point, it's it's just the elephant in the room of stopping reproduction.
Right. So there are herds, like you just mentioned, like the sulfurs, the Keigers, and herds with color. The more popular herds that people want to adopt don't seem to have the big herd management issues that the more grade horses. And I don't say that in terms of quality, is ones that people are not seeking out that particular herd.
Well, you know,
That's mostly it's just marketing. The Keigers took off once Disney did a movie about them. The Sulfurs took off a bit once they were promoted by breeders that had
Mhm.
some of the studs, and you know it's it's a matter of promotion and then limited supply. Both were small HMAs that had very limited amount of horses gathered every 4 years at best, and so there was more hype involved in it. You know, these other herds that you know, Oregon, we got to remember, there's been doing selective returns since day one. You know, a man named Bill Phillips who worked for the BLM in Burns, and when the BLM started taking over management of the horses, gave me a copy of his proposal to the national BLM, stating that, well, we were just going to do selective returns because that's basically what's been done with these herds forever. The Oregon's littered with horse traps, and the ranchers would put their horses out with the wild horses, bring them all in, throw the best back out, keep the other ones in their call to either train or to sell. And it was natural to the BLM employees in the late 70s when they took over to why not do the same thing? Because they gathered the whole area to see what they had. They could weed out clubfoot and stuff like that, and any genetic issues, and then put a healthy herd back out. And that's basically the fundamentals of management. You know, even our wildlife agencies, if they have herds of wildlife in areas that are suffering, they'll add and throw mixed bighorn sheep, or they'll put elk in from one area to
Right.
another to try to get genetic diversity up. And managing them for genetic diversity is a key responsibility anytime you're responsible for managing horses or any animal, basically, as far as that's concerned.
Okay. Does the BLM euthanize?
Do they
Well,
euthanize?
Do they euthanize?
in what?
Oh, if they're during a gather, if they have horses with broken legs or bad injuries, they will
Okay.
euthanize.
Okay.
It all depends, you know, but generally they will, and usually before they even get to the corrals, they'll have holding areas where they'll do the recent South Steens herd. They had quite a few euthanasias because of eye issues. I'm not sure, I can't remember the color of the horse, but it was a very common. It was either one horse passing it on, or it was a genetic issue, and so there was a lot of horses that were euthanized under the direction of a veterinarian because of eye and vision issues. And you know, they could have been a little more upfront about it and explained it better. So now they're taking a lot of slack for it, you know. But yeah, that's the opportunity to get in there and manage, and you have to. If you're gate cutting, you're not managing that. You're you know,
If you're just going by
it's just not
numbers.
yeah. So if once again with the smaller numbers, the more intensive management thoughts have to be put into it. And there's nothing wrong with you know, the BLM's good if you see a horse with a clearly broken leg out in the wild. And I'm not talking a limping horse. I'm talking a horse with a clearly broken leg. They will go out and euthanize it,
Okay.
you know, just because it's just a humane thing to do. And so we have to understand that, you know, it's not always a pretty picture out there. It's, you know, I had volunteers going out to help me pick up old barbed wire and stuff at the Kiger HMA. And unfortunately, there was two
Yeah.
horses with two broken legs there. And one of them was, you know, I spotted him a year earlier and the BLM could not find him. And he popped up a year later with a completely broken leg, but he looked like
Yeah.
Quasimodo because his muscles were so deformed from a year of compensating for that.
Yeah.
What he went through in that year was just absolutely horrible, you know.
Right.
And the BLM was able to euthanize both of them, you know, because the last thing
Okay.
you want to do is take people out to help out and have them, you know, it's something to learn, but it's not the kind of thing you need to stick in people's face. And
Right.
so it's just euthanasia is a big part of horse management in the wild. There's just no way around it, no way
Right.
whatsoever.
Go ahead, Kerry.
I'd like to provide just a little bit of stats for your listeners, and because I've been following this for a long time because I'm involved with the Mesa Verde horses and the low stress bait trapping and all of that. And the consistently for years, the BLM's fatality rate on gathers is about between 1 and 1.5%. And about half of those are pre-existing conditions. And, you know, like there was a lot of hoopla about the cremellos, but they are very prone to eye disorders and cancer of the face.
And that was the Southsteins.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, or clubfoot. I mean, do we want to keep horses with clubfoot, or they come in with broken legs or horrible scoliosis? And there
Yeah.
are issues. And the other half of that 1 to 1.5% usually are gather related, almost always in the pens. So horses being, you know, like fatally injured on the gather portion are very rare. I mean, occasionally it happens, very rare. Most of the injuries are broken necks and broken legs in the gather pens, because a lot of people don't realize if a horse hits its head just the right way, bang, it's
Neck will break.
in death. And, you know, they'll get a leg through. But the point I want to make is that, you know, consistently for decades, that 1 to 1.5%, half of which is pre-existing, that's an incredibly low percentage. Yes,
Yeah.
every life matters. In standard wildlife management, where they might have to gather and relocate bighorn sheep or elk or anything, what's considered an acceptable fatality rate is 4%.
Wow.
So
And
just
Kerry's right.
4%.
They're gathers, electric helicopter gathers are extremely statistically safe, especially the bigger the number. It's just, it really is safe. And it's unfortunate that, you know, that it's been used as a primary talking point for advocates against the horses being, you know, it truly is a safe, very safe way to put it. And bait trapping in its early days did not have a very good success rate because, you know, the horses are in that small confined area
Yeah.
where most of the accidents would happen in a larger gather anyway. So, you know, but bait trapping's got substantially better. But I think statistically, even to this day, bait trapping is more dangerous than helicopter gathers from a statistical point. You
Yeah.
know, but once again, it's just, you could have a helicopter gather that could go bad if they're rushing and stuff. But generally speaking, the stats show that it is an extremely safe way to gather. And when you got thousands of horses to gather, there is no alternative.
Another very common misconception that I see that I want to have you address is, and unfortunately I see this a lot in Mustang groups, is somebody pops up and says, oh, the BLM gathers horses so they can send them to slaughter. I see that as shocking. At least once a month I see somebody, and people respond and say, oh no, that's terrible.
Yeah, yeah. That funds
Do they send them to slaughter?
a lot of activists' bank accounts. There have been, you know, famously the Davis case of where he had something going with some employee and 1,100 horses got shipped. But he didn't say, I'm selling them to slaughter. He said that he was sending them to Mexico to be in films and all kinds of crazy stuff. You know what? I think to put that in perspective, in 2017-18, I got wind of an instruction memo from the White House at the time to BLM to do like mass gathers of horses and to enact the clause on euthanasia. And it came out as a draft memo, so it didn't have to be released to the public. It wasn't finalized. And BLM employees said, we will quit. We are not going to just mass euthanize horses. So there's a big discrepancy and misunderstanding between, you know, people that are pumping those stories for their own financial benefit and it's been a while since I have found the tracking, but similarly, the horses that are going over the border, which now are almost less than ever, not, I mean, it's still happening, it's still horrible, I'm not condoning that, about 1% are branded Mustangs. And that's because our inspections for equine slaughter were defunded. So slaughter's not illegal. Horse slaughter is not illegal in the United States. There's just no inspectors for it in terms of FDA. And there's supposed to be inspectors at the border, but there's not really. So there's 2011 Government Accounting Office report called The Unintended Consequences of Banning Horse Slaughter in the United States. And the shipping of horses, the conditions, because there's no inspection, is horrific.
Yeah.
It would be much more humane if you could slaughter them in your hometown than putting them on a truck for 3 or 4 days. And I don't even want to, I can't even think about it. But now that brings us around to the Mustang ransom game, where people say, oh, it's in a compact, we're going to ship Tuesday, and everybody starts raising money. So the recent case over at Fabricius here in Colorado, horses came into not a kill pen, a sale barn, an auction house, where every Wednesday our local sale barn buys and sells cows and sheep and horses and everything else. That's how livestock is traded. And these were titled Mustangs recently through the AIP program, the Adoption Incentive Program, which is another whole discussion. But Fabricius goes in, he buys them 16 horses for $350 a piece, which is meat price. And the next day they're on his website, and all the advocates lost their minds, and he sold all of those horses in just a few days for $850 to $1,200
for a huge profit.
That's a nice piece of change there for a few days' work.
Yeah.
And that happens all over the country.
Yeah.
So they're not slaughtered, they're being held for ransom. These guys, they take that money, they go buy to the sale barn, buy some more Mustangs.
Yeah.
But the question is, does the BLM sell to slaughter?
Yeah.
Does not work well for the BLM because of the position they put themselves in. They handle that issue on a plausible deniability basis. So the Tom Davis horses, it was like 1,700 horses they sold to him through the sale authority program, which gives them title initially. And he signed a piece of paper saying he was not going to be selling them to slaughter, which is very easy to do because he was selling them to somebody else who was going to be selling them to slaughter. So he wasn't violating any laws. And there was a substantial more than one employee that would, at any BLM office that has 1,700 horses, sale authority through it, there's a whole bunch of employees that know what's going on. And once again, if you have plausible deniability, you're not the one selling them to slaughter, and there will be no kickback. And there wasn't on the Tom Davis issue. Now fast forward, we have an adoption incentive program. We all know when that was brought up at the meetings of the higher BLM offices, the first person that brought that up, somebody in the room had to have said, well, you know what, there's some places where those horses, are just, we're going to be paying these people $1,000 and giving them the title, and then what's going to happen to the horses? And it was a program that was obviously going to be abused. And the reason it's still in effect, even though the BLM has fine-tuned it a bit, is because to this day, the BLM still has plausible deniability in that. The economics are there, and over and over again, we've seen it, and it's documented, where a family of 4 would go adopt 16 Mustangs. They've got a large pasture. They might have to throw them a bit of hay in the winter, but $16,000 plus 16 times 500 at meat price. And when I say meat price, anytime you're saying sales yard, it doesn't matter if it's a kill pen or not. A sales yard is a sales yard for an unhandled Mustang. Their chances of ending up in any good situation are pretty slim in a sales yard. once again, those people with the 16 Mustangs selling them at the sales yard, they're not selling them to slaughter, they're selling them to sales yard. They have the title. There's no recourse for them either. And a very simple process for the adoption incentive program is to require, if they want their $1,000, to show that the horse can be haltered. The BLM pays trainers $1,000 to fully gentle Mustangs. And they don't expect anything from these other people they're paying $1,000 to adopt a Mustang. So
Right.
just that one thing of requiring them, and if you're paying them $1,000, is it really that much to ask them to have that horse being haltered? And then you're eliminating the family that's going to grab 16 of them to go and sell them at the sales yard later on. So why has that program not changed? Because the BLM has plausible deniability in that program. In the sale authority programs, the same way. You can still go get 4 Mustangs at the BLM sale authority right now. And the moment you walk out that door with that title, there's nobody tracking those horses. There's nobody keeping track of anything. And it's plausible deniability is the issue. The BLM is literally doing everything they can to liquidate as many horses as possible from get them off their books, and
Right.
it doesn't take much to fix the problem. The bragging about 7,000 adoptions in the past year means nothing if 5,000 of them are adoption incentive program horses, and it doesn't mean anything that only 60 or 70 have been documented to have turned up in these sales yards where people just collected the money and even bragged about it. That doesn't matter either. The fact that it's happening matters. And so it's optics, and the BLM is not good with optics. They never have been too concerned with optics, and a lot of their bad optics comes back to nip them in the butt, and it will continue until they fix sale authority and adoption incentive programs.
Kerry?
Sale authority program was technically put into place for the BLM to be able to liquidate parts. I even think the original sales authority program authorized them to sell horse parts or horse products,
Really?
as the idea was that you might have to get some kind of processing company to come in that would want to buy 1,000 of them,
Wow.
because the original intent on that was not to help an older horse get adopted or a
Right.
3 strikes horse get adopted,
Okay.
and we've got 18-month-old horses going out of sale authority. So it's just, and they're off the books the moment they go off as sale authority. So does the BLM sell horses to slaughter? No. Are they doing everything they can to make sure that the horses aren't going to slaughter? No, they're not.
Gotcha.
They could do a lot more very easily.
Kerry?
But they're going to end up with a lot more horses too.
Yeah.
A lot more horses.
Yeah.
It's something that, the public could actually help with if they understood how to go about it. So, screaming on Facebook is not helpful. I agree with Lee. The issue is, and this was raised at the last Wild Horse and Burro advisory meeting a lot, which I already knew it, but they really made the point. And if anybody really wants to know what's going on, that's a great place to get an education. They meet once or twice a year. But the policy, and this was how the Tom Davis slippery slope happened. The policy of BLM is not to sell to slaughter, and you sign an agreement saying you will not sell the horse for commercial purposes, meaning some kind of processing.
Right.
But that's not statutory. So that's a policy, but it's not a law. So that's a slippery slope. So if people want to, as you know, once you have title, that's personal property. That's like a car. If I want to sell that to my Uncle Bob, I can. No, there's no law against it. If the public wants to be sure that Mustangs are never sold to slaughter, then there needs to be statutory teeth in a law passed by Congress. Only Congress can pass laws.
Right.
So contacting your congressman that you want laws passed to prevent Mustangs from going across the border is different than yelling about BLM sells to slaughter, which is a fabrication, a distortion. BLM, once that horse is titled, BLM can do nothing. Even the most dedicated, committed BLM person has no power because that horse is titled. So there's policy and there's law. Congress makes laws, BLM makes policy, but they can't enforce anything unless there's a statute that says so.
Right.
And one thing Kerry said earlier too about the BLM employees, you'll probably find that any BLM employee that you'll deal with on the ground level and the corrals and stuff like that would not want any of the horses going to slaughter. It just they're in that department because they like horses and they like the department.
Yeah.
BLM has multitude of other departments they could go work in if they chose to, and then they all these other decisions are made at far higher levels. You know, even Oregon's no gather policy, as a Washington no gather policy. The person that runs the program in Oregon absolutely doesn't agree with it and absolutely want to do gathers and maintain numbers, but you know, there's only limited so much they can do. So it's important also to kind of not to focus hate against the actual employees, because they are not the policy makers at all. You know, they're just like you and me that happen to work for the BLM. The BLM policies are the key things, and it's these policy makers that need to be directed at, you know, no, we don't like this, we don't like that. The blame and the hate should never be towards the BLM employees, the boots on the ground employees. A totally different story. Important to remember too. You can not support the BLM, but still support the BLM employees and that are handling and managing the horses. You can do both.
Right.
And that bothers me when I see, you know, so much hate and vitriol and death threats against BLM employees. And many of them, I know many BLM employees who could have been promoted up the food chain, but they stay in the horse program because they love horses.
Yeah.
The kinds of, again, statutory changes that need to happen need to be made in Congress. And as we've seen with the San Wash Basin gather, our illustrious governor, Jared Polis, was lobbied ad nauseum by certain, you know, San Wash Basin fans. And I don't really think he gets it. It's just that when you have a constituency of people who are, you know, believing these myths about wild horses, that they should all be free, that they're running around on fields of waving green, and then, you know, is he going to alienate? This is an election year, right? Going to alienate his constituency by, you know, going against that prevailing romance about wild horses. So this is the same problem in Congress. So I really invite and encourage people to educate themselves about what it's like in places with 10 inches of rain, what it's like in drought, and lobby Congress to allocate more money to the Wild Horse and Burro program, mandate, you know, gathers, get more off-range pasture, mandate fertility control. And they've sort of done a lot of that, but short of really mandating it. It's kind of a suggestion. And so find that without, you know, swallowing all the crazy.
Yeah.
Or do we get to talk about the cray craze now?
Yeah, no.
We're not going to. In fact, we're going to end on that.
What? Actually, there is a couple issues that she brought up that I'd like to expand on about advocates and misinformation. A lot of the advocate groups, I'm never saying they don't have their heart into what they're doing, and they're doing it for all the wrong reasons. They're compassionate, they love the horses, they're doing anything they possibly can to help the horses in their view. But it gets to the point when money starts being involved and when they start being dependent on a donation button then it triggers certain things they're not allowed to say. I do believe one advocate group that did sign on with a path forward in 2018. I'm not sure what their current status is and if they support it or not, but from what I remember, did they take a licking from all the other advocate groups that pounced on them for being a part of the BLM and approving of gathers and actually saying, yes, some should be gathered.
Yeah.
And I do believe that was the donation button. That was it. Things dried up, and I don't think you'll ever see another advocate group do that again. If you're an advocate group trying to promote that there shouldn't be a gathers, you have to throw information out there to try to convince people. A couple of the key ones is one that I don't really like is how they make the ranchers, cattle ranchers out to be the villains. We could go in depth of how the cattle ranching has been going on for 120 years in these HMAs, and nobody gave a crap anything that went on out there until the past few recent years. Otherwise, these are areas that Kerry mentioned earlier, nobody goes to and nobody developed. But the advocate groups will make them an enemy, and that does not help matters at all. The last thing you need is the group that the horses share the pastures with to be mad at them, or to be to be the villains in the thing. The other issues is their excuses for how to get away from gathers. A lot, and it creates strange bedfellows with advocate groups. There's a group, Western Watersheds Project, I do believe is their name, and they're basically an anti-ranching on public lands group, and there might have been good reasons, and they might have good reasons why they feel in certain areas that ranching and riparian areas especially is detrimental, and they probably have a lot of good programs, but lately I've noticed they've been latching on to some wild horse advocate groups, and the common theme for both of them is predators. It's all about predators, and that's why we're in the position we're in right now, that the cattle ranchers want all the predators removed. They want all the predators removed, that's just the nature of it. But the same reason they want the cattle off these areas is the same reason they would want the horses out of these areas. And I've searched their websites high and low, and I can yet to find a written document of them supporting wild horses being out on public lands. But they promote the cougar issue because they feel the cattlemen are killing off all the cougar. Well, cougar have had almost 400 years now to develop horses as a food source for them, yet they have not. And there's a good reason for it. 95% of their diet is deer, and the other 5% is small animals, because that's easiest for them to catch and deal with. A horse, will a cougar kill a horse? Maybe a large lane horse, yes. A foal, certainly. I've personally seen foals die from their cougar injuries, but it's not something you can count on. It's not something that you can manage. You can't just say we're going to stop hunting cougar in this area and that's going to fix the wild horse problem. Well, no, it's not, because the deer are all going to be wiped out. And I have absolutely documented in the Kiger HMA, where I used to stumble across deer all the time, it dwindled down to all of a sudden I realized I could go out and not see a deer for months on end. And that's when we started finding foals attacked by cougars. And so the cougar extinguished their natural food source, desperately went after, foals as a substitute, and then mostly moved on their own. And the foal survival rate went up because foals are not enough. That's a meal maybe 2-3 months of the year, and that's it. If there's no deer after the foaling season's done, the cougar have to move on. So it's not anything we can manage. But yet an advocacy group for wild Mustangs and an advocacy group for like the Western Watersheds Project, they find that common ground in that narrative about cougar. It's the problem because we have no predators. Well, horses are native to North America, and they are native to North America. But back then they had saber-toothed tigers, bears that were 12 feet tall, and various other predators that kept that population down. Well, it's just not there anymore. Just like camels originated in North America, but that doesn't mean we need to start turning loose all the camels we have out into the wild. It's just advocacy groups have to maintain their donations coming in, and they get dependent on it. And when then their narrative is limited at that point. And I have an uppermost respect for an advocacy group that can step forward and say, there is situations where horses need to be gathered. because they're really going on a limb there. And actually, I think the one, Return to Freedom had, I think they were one of the ones that were in the path forward and took a lot of hit for it. But yet, of all the Mustang documentaries I've seen come out, they had a big part in one. I think it was produced by Robert Redford. And it was actually one of the best. I wish I could remember the name. I should have made a notes about it, because it is, everybody that wants to know about Mustang should watch it. They do leave out a few points, but the vast amount of issues and subjects they talk about has never been done before in a Mustang documentary. And mostly the Mustang documentaries show Mustangs climbing out of pens at trap sites, being chased by helicopters.
Yeah.
They're all based on emotion, and that gets your donation button spinning. But is the public more educated after that? No, they're not. They have no idea. They just think, oh, we got to just quit shooting cougars and then everything could be solved. And that's not the case. It's the case if you have a donation button dependency, but not if you really want to control the numbers in the wild.
Okay. Thank you, both of you, for your time and your ideas. And we might do this again down the road.
So
It
Lynn,
was a pleasure. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, it was really a